friend and famous literary figure and occultist, Frank Harris, kindly took him under his roof. Frank Harris lived with a woman by the name of Nellie O'Hara. If what has been written in later years can be believed, Nellie had a friend in America, Pauline Pierce, who was married to Marvin Pierce, head of the McCall Corporation. In early 1924, Pauline traveled to France to stay with her friend. Thus it was that four individuals came together: Frank Harris, Nellie O'Hara, Pauline Pierce, and Aleister Crowley. According to Crowley's diaries, during this period in Paris, Crowley underwent the supreme ordeal, linked with his realization of the grade of ipsissimus. According to a description of the rite, on the appointed day, the candidate is attended by one or more chosen and experienced attendants whose duty is A. to exhaust him sexually by every known means, B. to rouse him sexually by every known means. Every device and artifice of the courtesan is to be employed, and every stimulant known to the physician. If Crowley did go through this ordeal in 1924, then it is highly likely, based on his previous experiences, that his closest associates of that time, including Nellie and Pauline, performed as his magical assistants. Pauline Pierce returned to America in early October of 1924. 8 months later, on June the 8th, 1925, she gave birth to a girl named Barbara. Barbara Pierce married George H.W. Bush, who eventually became the 41st President of the United States. And they had a son, George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. Could the wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley, be George W. Bush's grandfather? In 1925, Crowley received a letter from Theodore Roos of the OTO in Germany. A vacancy had become available for international head of the OTO. They had chosen Baphomet.
To the British, and indeed the Americans, I may have been a flesh-eating devil, but the Germans obviously still appreciated the lore of Thelema. I was still Baphomet, an ipsissimus, the great beast, 666.
Hello, I'm Roberta Crisson. This is Facets, Politics 80, one of a series of political interviews with ramifications for all of us this year of presidential elections. I'm privileged and pleased and honored to have next to me Mrs. Barber Bush, the wife of presidential hopeful George Bush, who has survived a harrowing 2 days to get here and sit in here for our interview today. And I'd like to welcome you and say hello to Pennsylvania. And I wish we had better weather for you, but hopefully it will clear soon. Mrs. Bush will be speaking with us today on issues that are near and dear to her heart and which she feels are of vital importance to the country as a whole. I'd like to begin our questions, if I could, Mrs. Bush, on a rather serious note. You brought in your bag this morning with 2 small buttons on it, something that you said was very important to you, and I'd like for you to explain those if you could.
Well, at a breakfast this morning, someone gave me 2 buttons, one for George and one for me, that had a 50 on it. This was they said, we must wear it until we get back our hostages. And I said to the lady, but there aren't 50 hostages, there are 53 hostages. And I feel very strongly that the President of the United States has really let us down. There are 3 hostages held by the government itself and 50 held by the terrorist, so-called students. When the president says we've had a breakthrough, incidentally, the day of a primary, we've had a breakthrough and maybe we're going to get the 50 shifted over to the government. Well, what difference does that make? They've had 3 all along, and they have not returned them to us. So the government is not acting in good faith. And when the president puts 50 Christmas trees to symbolize the hostages, I think it's a deception to the United States public. There are 53 hostages. So I think the button really is sort of sad.
What do you think should be done now? Do you think there are other steps that need to be taken?
No, I think the president has taken the right step. You know, George, about a month ago, before the Illinois primary, at a World Affairs luncheon in Illinois, called for breaking off diplomatic relations, the complete economic sanctions, and sending home the diplomats. Because he said, enough. We tried the World Court, it didn't work. We tried the United Nations Commission, it didn't work. We have got to show the Iranian government and the Iranian people that we are standing behind our commitments and our hostages. So I think the president has finally done the right thing.
Your husband said last night on an interview program that in the areas of foreign policy and foreign affairs, he feels that he has probably more experience than many of the other, or most of the other men in the race, especially in answer to one question to Ronald Reagan. He felt that his experience, especially in foreign policy, was what sets him apart from the others.
I think that's only one thing, Roberta. I think, certainly in foreign affairs, George is the only person running for president who has been a congressman, the ambassador to the United Nations, the chief of the U.S. liaison office to the People's Republic of China, a fourth of the world's population, incidentally, and the head of the whole intelligence system. So there's no question about that. And I think that George better understands the world as it is, and the fact that President Carter is reacting. He's not acting. He doesn't have a plan. He just reacts to pressures and to different problems that arise. He doesn't have a world plan for the United States foreign policy. I think George Bush is the only person who really understands the foreign policy situation. For instance, Governor Reagan, who is a fine man, but he has just the background Jimmy Carter had. He's a governor of a state. When asked what he should do about Afghanistan, he suggested that we blockade Cuba. Well, now, Cubans did not invade Afghanistan. The Russians did. So I think there's a difference in the background. I also would suggest that Governor Reagan, along with President Carter, vacillates a little bit, because when it came to boycotting the Olympics, they went back and forth and back and forth. There's no question in my mind, that awful as it is, that George was right about the Olympics. We must let the Russian people see that we are against aggression, that we are going to boycott the Olympics. You know, athletes are Americans too, and they're being asked to make a tremendous sacrifice. But better make that sacrifice than make one of serving your country in a war.
Your husband has stated that he does favor registration of the military, since you mentioned
he doesn't think that we need to reinstate the draft now, but he favors an equal registration across the board.
Is this to
like
equalize the yeah, well, this is what I was getting at. I think to shore up a rather sagging volunteer registration. I understand that there are some shortages in middle ranks and what have you in the armed forces.
But of course, registration wouldn't do that, I don't believe. But it would just be like the Boy Scouts. You're being prepared. We're talking about a world in a terrible period. The absolutely unthinkable is to go to war. George feels that there is such a thing as peace through strength. He feels that we have a much better chance to keep our country out of war and have decades of peace if we are strong. But we have a much less chance if we are weak, and that goes across the board for defense spending.
This was my next question in terms of defense spending. your husband does favor an increase in defense spending in any particular areas?
Well, now, you've got me, Roberta, because I am not an authority on MRVs and that kind of thing.
Oh, of course not.
But George, I believe, feels that we have to put back into the budget the defense methods that President Ford had in, that President Carter cut. I think President Carter's seeing that now. Plus, we must get back to the 3 of the Navy, which we have lost.
Yes.
So I think in those fields, that's not my field.
I can well understand it. That we wouldn't, none of us, I think, is an authority, especially on the areas of armed forces that need a special shoring up. But
of course, you see, George is, though, because he presented the intelligence and the estimates of what the Russians are doing to the President of the United States for almost a year. He knows about those things.
He stated last night that in order
I wish I'd heard him.
Oh, well, I certainly wish you were supposed to be there last night, as a matter of fact, weren't you? He stated last night that there was in order to blockade Cuba, as you were mentioning earlier, it would take almost our whole Atlantic fleet, which I think is indicative of what you're saying as far as our Navy resources.
We no longer have a 3-ocean Navy.
And
I would go a little bit further than George. I think if I were the Russians, I would say to myself, wouldn't it be grand if the Americans would blockade Cuba? That would take the fleet out of the Mediterranean, away from the Middle East, where the Russians really have their interests. And wouldn't it be like a chess game where we made the dumb move, I think.
It'd be interesting to see what would happen, but not very pleasant, I'm sure. Let's get to domestic fares, which I'm sure concern all of us. We all have to buy food and pay taxes and heat our homes, and I'm sure this is on the minds of many, many voters, perhaps even more than some of the foreign affairs.
I'm sure that's true.
How does your husband feel about inflation? How would he control it? He doesn't like it, I'm sure. How would he control it?
He was lucky because we were able to help him. We have a grandson, the most adorable thing you ever saw in your life, who has a Mexican mother and obviously an American father, and he thinks in Spanish and speaks in English, therefore doesn't do either very well. He's lucky. He has a mother and father who have put him into a Montessori school where he's learning to read. It's important. We're lucky. I want to make that possibility for everybody.
And so we hope that in your aspirations that you're able to do this, and for your husband, George Bush, who is pushing hard for a win in Pennsylvania next Tuesday in the presidential primary. We're out of time. We must say goodbye, but I thank you very much for coming to Reading and for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to share this moment with us and your feelings, and to bring to us the message from your husband.
I loved being here. Thank you, Roberta.
This is Roberta Crisson, Facets, Politics 80.
I have some sources, some confidential sources, who furnish me information from time to time. And there's code words for some of these various operations. The code word that I'm going to tell you about right now, this is in my source's own handwriting. He doesn't write too well, so I may make some mistakes. The Black Rose is the code word for this. It's a clandestine group of U.S. government operatives, primarily the CIA, which has for many years run illegal drugs and arms operations in both Southeast Asia via the Golden Triangle and the Middle East via the Golden Crescent, funded by the British socialist-based Russell Trust drug cartel. The Black Rose's current chairman and co-founder is an individual known as the White Rose, or GHWB, a known bisexual pedophile and CFR, Council on Foreign Relations conspirator. This man, as a top member of the Skull and Bones Society, developed the heroin ring, which, while servicing as ambassador, along with his CIA activities. The Black Rose also runs cocaine through Panama from Colombia to the offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. That's directly from the government.